Now, less than a year from the 2024 presidential election, and Donald Trump remains a clear and present danger to democracy. A recent Fox News poll shows the twice impeached, quadruple indicted ex-president leading the Republican primary race, with 62% of those polled preferring him over mini dictator Ron DeSantis, who is only at 14%. We already know a second Trump term would be even more dangerous than the first. He's vowed to demolish the so-called deep state, plans to weaponize the DOJ to go after his enemies, and he wants to implement terroristic immigration policies. Now, historians warn that Trump is running as America's first dictator after his divisive rhetoric took an alarming turn recently, echoing authoritarian leaders like Hitler and Mussolini. Here's what he said last week while on the campaign trail in New Hampshire.
We pledge to you that we will root out the communists, Marxists, fascists, and the radical left thugs that live like vermin within the confines of our country. The real threat is not from the radical right. The real threat is from the radical left. And it's growing every day, every single day. The threat from outside forces is far less sinister, dangerous, and grave than the threat from within. Our threat is from within.
Joining me now, Anne Applebaum, staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of Twilight of Democracy. Anne, thanks so much for being here. This is such an important conversation, and I think we have to have it over and over again to underscore what is at stake. I hate actually playing Trump sound. I hate giving him any space. But I think it's important for our viewers to see it's his words and to hear the people cheering, frankly, too, while he says them. Why is Trump using words like vermin to describe his opponents?
So the word vermin, which has indeed been used by the past, famously it was used by Hitler to describe Jews. It was actually, I'm speaking to you today from Poland. There was a famous poster here during the Second World War put up by the Germans that showed Jews as lice. And so we understand very deeply what this, what the expression means. But what vermin implies is that these people are inhuman. They're not people. We don't have to respect them. They don't have any rights. Vermin are something that you crush, like weeds. And any dictator or any leader or any elected leader who uses language like that is saying, I have a right to lead, and my opponents don't have a right to live, let alone have human rights or respect by the rule of law. So what Trump is doing is setting up a mood or an atmosphere that will allow him to break laws and will allow him to go after enemies.
And Anne, but let's talk about how that environment has persisted, because back on January 7th, 2021, you wrote what Trump and his mob taught the world about America. That's the day after January 6th happened. And I think you and I both thought, and perhaps the world at large, that because of what happened on January 6th, we would never see Donald Trump again be a serious contender. And yet, here we are again, almost 3 years later, on the eve of a presidential election in 2024, and it seems situationally to be the same. Is it because people are just not paying attention? Is it because people have fatigue over the alarm bells ringing? I mean, what do you think is the reason why we find ourselves almost deja vu in the same situation?
I think the primary reason is that Trump's party decided to accept his anti-democratic language and his behavior, and they refused to impeach him. They refused to condemn him. They allowed him to go on pretending that he'd really been elected president, that the election was somehow stolen for a long time. I think that's one of the reasons. Another reason is that, a lot of Americans don't pay much attention to politics most of the time. And a lot of them believe the propaganda that the election was stolen again, and also that there are, evil vermin on the far left who are trying to destroy our country. It's a conspiracy theory that people have fallen into. I can't stress enough again how much what I wrote on the day after January the 6th still applies. The rest of the world watches the United States as the leading democracy, and a re-election of Trump would be a real statement that democracy in America is dysfunctional, that we were not able to get rid of a potentially autocratic leader, that we weren't able to resist that kind of rhetoric, and that we won't be playing the role as leader of the democratic world in the future. Repeatedly, magazines, newspapers, politicians all over the world are listening. And it's not just about, American support for this or that cause. It's the America as a symbol that's really in danger of crashing.
And I don't think Donald Trump is competent enough or capable enough to pull off any of this on his own. My greatest fear is actually not Trump himself. It's the army of loyalists that he intends to install, the ones that have been through kind of round one, saw kind of where the Achilles heels are and figured I'm going to do it bigger and better in round two in that second Trump presidency. I look at people like Bill Barr, Kenneth Chesebro, Jeff Clark. I look at the lawyers also, right? The lawyers and the judges that perhaps are the loyalists that he wants in place. What can be done to ensure that the American public understands that it's not Trump operating in a vacuum, that he actually has people, including the Heritage Foundation, for example, that are orchestrating kind of this next Trump presidency?
So I would say, first of all, there's a phenomenon of leaders who have lost power, who return to power, and who are much more autocratic in their second term or their second attempt at power. And actually, Putin is an example of that, the president of Russia. He was out of power. He came back much better prepared to repress his country and to build a much more powerful dictatorship. There's a version of that in Viktor Orban, who's the autocratic leader of Hungary. So you're absolutely right to point to the fact that because it's the second term, because there are people who are prepared and ready, that we're in a different situation. I mean, I think the best thing that we can do is what you're doing now, which is talk about it calmly, explain to people what the consequences are, talk about what the stakes of this election are, and not just, who's winning and who's losing, who's up and who's down. It's very important to prepare people to understand what kind of election it's going to be.
And I got to go. It's always so great to have you here. I will say the following to your last point. The Heritage Foundation, with this plan, has decided it's plug and play with a Nikki Haley, a Ron DeSantis, or a Donald Trump. And so democracy is in peril, even if it isn't Donald Trump. Anne Applebaum, thanks for being here. I appreciate it.